Hello, my name is Emmy DeGrappa. Each week, we bring you stories asking our guests the question why. We learn about passion, purpose, and the human experience. Brought to you by Wyoming Humanities with the generous support of the Wyoming Community Foundation. This is What's Your Why? Today, we are talking to Matthew Spangler. Matthew is a playwright, director, and professor of performance studies at San Jose State University in the San Francisco Bay Area. Welcome, Matthew.
Great. Thank you. I'm honored to be here.
Yeah, well, I'm honored to have you. And I've been reading your bio, and it's like, oh my gosh, does this man sleep at night? That's what I wanted to ask you, because you've done so much and so many diverse things. But the first thing I want to ask, so that we can get to know you on a personal level, is where did you grow up?
Well, I grew up in Casper. My dad also was born and raised in Wyoming, and my grandma was born in Wheatland and grew up on a farm there. So my family goes back several generations in the state.
Okay, what did your dad do for a living?
He was a judge. His dad was also a judge, so my granddad. And I think they hoped I would go to law school, when I was in high school. I think that was sort of my dad's vague hope, is that I would be the third generation of judges in the family. But I didn't do that. I did something different. But
how many brothers and sisters do you have?
I have two younger brothers.
Oh, okay, so 3 boys in the family. Are any of them judges?
No. One's in the Army. He's a major in the Army, and the other one does light design for theater and corporate events.
Okay, so the two of you actually went the artistic road.
Yeah, I suppose so. Yeah, 2 of us went into the arts, and the middle one went into the military.
Oh, that's interesting, especially when your dad had a different vision for you for your life. Well, what drew you to the arts?
Well, I had some incredible teachers in Casper. As you note in the introduction here, I live in California now, and I am a professor at San Jose State, and then I'm a playwright outside the university. And I wouldn't have done any of those things if it wasn't for some just terrific teachers I had in high school, at Natrona County High School in Casper. I had a AP English teacher, Tom Ring, who was just amazing, and a French and Russian teacher who's still there. Scott Underbrink still teaches French and Russian at NC. But if it weren't for those folks, and other teachers too, I had a great orchestra teacher, Paul Fox, but I mentioned these people because they just kind of introduced me to a world of thinking and literature and reading, and I just kind of never left that. So I attribute it to the folks that I knew in high school as teachers.
So what was your journey out of Wyoming? Because I read in your bio that you first went to get your BS at Northwestern University, right?
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, Northwestern, as you may know, is a little bit north of Chicago. And so when I left Wyoming, I wanted to, or I should say when I graduated high school, like a lot of kids, I wanted something different. I wanted to experience a different way of life. So I was looking for maybe a university in an urban setting. I was looking at Northwestern, Georgetown, schools like that. And I wanted to study theater. And Northwestern had then and still has a very good theater program. So when I got admitted there, I was, decided to take the chance and jump and see what life would be like in Chicago.
And so have you worked in theater yourself? Because your degrees are in performance studies, but have you worked on the stage?
Yeah, of course. A lot of us who work in theater now, I do mostly playwriting, but almost all of us started as actors. When you're 17, 18, 19, 20, and into your 20s, almost everybody working in theater starts out as an actor because that's your first thing. You love it, and then as you get a little bit older, you start to see who's really good at what. And, there were other people who are better actors than I am. And I ended up doing more directing and writing, which is what I do now.
Well, I have found, as I've talked to quite a few people in theater and performance, and learned, about their lives. A lot of actors on the stage are actually introverts. Like they come alive on the stage. Is that true?
Well, I think that probably is true. There's the stereotype of the theater person who's all extroverted and, out there and whatever. But absolutely, I think for the, if they're not introverts, then they feel more comfortable on stage playing the role of somebody else than, they might be playing themselves in a social situation, Yeah, I mean, what great comfort that is to step up on stage and get to be a different person. And you can really do no wrong when you're playing on stage, as long as you say your lines, as long as you say the right line at the right time and don't trip on the furniture, you can do no wrong in a theater play, because whatever choice you make, well, that's who the character is, but in normal life, gosh, you can go wrong all over the place in social situations. So the stage can be a kind of remarkably liberating place for a lot of people.
I think that's very true. And I've been a professional dancer, so that's what I know about performance. But I think it would be so hard to be on the stage and memorize lines. What was the first play that you remember that you were really felt like you were at home on the stage?
Oh, wow. Well, I don't know. I mean, I did theater throughout my time in high school in Casper. And, I remember doing my first play in grade school in Casper. I don't know. I've always felt comfortable in theater, and it's such a remarkably collaborative art form, theater is, because, you've got the director and the cast and designers, a costume designer, a set designer, a music designer, sound designer. So you've got all these people working together on a production. And for people who like creating in that kind of very collaborative environment, theater can be super fun and satisfying. So I think for me, it was about that kind of collaborative creation. But then the other thing with theater is you have an opening date, so you have to be ready by whatever the date is, February 19th. Let's say that's your opening date. No matter what, you've got an audience that's coming in on February 19th to see the show, and you've got to be ready for them. And so that's also particular. A novelist can live with their novel for years and years and years, and they can revise it and send it out when they think it's truly ready. Theater doesn't work that way. Gosh, February 19th rolls around, and no matter what you've got to stand up on the stage and perform for an audience. And I suppose I find that very energizing about that art form. Music is that way too, I suppose. If you're in music, you've got a concert date and you have to be ready for it. But those live performance forms are great for that, because it's always risky and you don't know if you're going to get it put together in time,
Mm-hmm.
But it's a lot of fun for that.
And why script writing? What made you think that was something that you were going to jump into? What is your passion about that?
Well, I left undergraduate in Chicago and I went to Ireland for a master's degree. I studied a school there called Trinity College, which is in the center of Dublin. And in those days, Dublin had a lot of immigrants that were moving in, refugees, asylum seekers, immigrants from all over the world were coming to Dublin to be part of their high-tech industry, which was growing in Ireland at the time. And I just found in the master's degree program that I was in, which was also theater, that a lot of my friends were immigrants from various places. And I spent time with them and I sort of saw Irish life through their eyes. And then we started doing theater together about immigrant experiences and what does it mean to be a person of color living in Ireland. And then I sort of brought some of that back to the United States, where I did my PhD at North Carolina in Chapel Hill. And so for me, I think it kind of came about, and a lot of my plays now are about immigrant experiences. And I think that's why it was something that started for me 20, 25 years ago when I was in school. And I just found that a lot of my friends were people who were immigrating in, and then we were creating art about their experiences of living in this place. And I've sort of never left that. So why writing? Well, I don't know. I suppose as a writer, you kind of get to decide what the project is. And that's fun. An actor has to audition for 100 pieces and you get cast in one, and then that's the one that you have to do. But a writer actually gets to decide, because you decide what you want to write about. And a lot of my plays are adaptations. I adapt books of writers often, not always, but often I adapt a writer's book for the stage. My most produced play is an adaptation of The Kite Runner by Khaled Hosseini, who some listeners of this might know the book. It's a very popular book, but Khaled himself came to the United States as a refugee from Afghanistan. And the book is also about a father and son who come to California from Kabul, Afghanistan. And so that's my most produced play, but it's fairly typical of the sort of work that I would do, is to work with somebody like Khaled and turn the book into a play, and then see that be performed.
So what are the challenges? Because I can see, like you were saying earlier, about someone who writes a novel and can take a lot of time developing character and developing the whole, scene about, painting that picture in someone's mind. And in theater, you have this moment, where you have to give that description, develop that character very quickly. What do you find the most challenging about that?
Yeah, I think the most challenging thing about theater is to just hold the audience's attention. Like whatever's on stage has to hold the attention of the audience. And if it doesn't, well, that's deadly. They get bored. They might leave in a worst case scenario. People start walking out of your show. If there's an intermission and you look over the audience and notice that it's somewhat smaller than it was before the intermission, that just crushes your soul a little bit as you're going into the second act. And I think that's the biggest challenge of theater, is holding an audience's attention at the same time being true to the themes and subject matter that you want to be true to, so you can't just get up there and put on Christmas lights and do a dance and hold audience's attention. Like you're also trying to be true to whatever is the story you're trying to tell. So you're trying to be true to this, like, really whatever important story that you want to share with an audience, and at the same time hold their attention for 2 hours. That's hard.
I agree. And I would say, because you adapted the Kite Runner to the stage, and that person is still alive, right? They're still alive, and they're probably critical, because they wrote a book and they have, opinions about what you're doing. So how does that work?
Well, everybody's different. Absolutely. Every writer is different in how they relate to their works, and they relate to an adaptation of it. Khaled Hosseini is just about the most generous and kind person you can possibly imagine. We would get together to meet. We both live close to each other here in the San Francisco Bay Area. And so we would meet at a Starbucks, and I would bring drafts of the script and we'd read them together. And he would say things like, "Now, you're the expert on playwriting, so I don't know if I want to suggest this, but what would you think about changing this or that?" And I'm like, "What? You're Khaled Hosseini. You wrote The Kite Runner. Of course we'll change this or that," But he was always so deferential to me as a writer of theater that, it was almost embarrassing how kind he is. But everybody's different. That's what it was like working with him. It was a really great experience because of his generosity and his kindness. Other writers on the other end of the spectrum are maybe less interested. They might say, "Oh, I really don't have time to read the script. Just tell me when opening night is, and if I can be at the theater, I will." That's the other end of the spectrum, is a writer who's like, "I'm working on other projects now. Great that you want to adapt my book, but I don't have time to work with you on it. Just let me know when the show opens." So somewhere along those two spectrums is where most people are as writers when they see their work adapted. Yeah.
So when you read the book, because you read the book and then you just could envision this in your mind, you could see how this was going to be something, the story worth telling on the stage.
Yeah, absolutely. So in terms of my own journey, I mentioned I went to Ireland and did a master's degree and came back with a real interest in immigration and the arts, which I pursued in a PhD program at North Carolina, Chapel Hill. And then I was hired as a professor here at San Jose State in California. So I moved out here then. And I read Kite Runner within the first, month or two of living here, because I was trying to read some books that are set locally. I was thinking about books I would want to teach in my classes that my students might want to be interested in. So I was reading literature set in the San Francisco Bay Area. And I read Kite Runner. It had recently been published a year before I read it, about a year after it was published. And yeah, it's a great story. Gosh, I mean, it's a first-person narrative. It's got highs and lows. It's got humor. And so Khaled and I had a mutual friend, another professor at San Jose State. And through this guy, I emailed Khaled Hosseini and said, introduced myself and said, what do you think about a play based on your book? And it kind of went from there.
That's like the dream story, right? That's like,
yeah.
And then for it to receive so many awards and accolades, I've been reading about that. And I would love to see the theater piece. It sounds beautiful. One thing that was really coming to mind when you were talking earlier about refugees and immigrants and the times we live in right now, it almost sounds like a lot's changed, but nothing's changed. It's a very interesting, to hear you talk about it. And what are your feelings about that?
Yeah, well, I teach courses about refugees and asylum seeking and how those communities are represented in the arts. So in my day job, so to speak, at the university, that's what I would be teaching. So I think about that a lot, of course. Gosh, what can you say? We've got 80 million people in the world who are displaced, which means that they've been forced out of their home due to some sort of political violence. That's about 1 in 100 people on the planet are in that situation, which is very high. It's the highest that number's ever been in human history. And so since the 50s, we've had this refugee agreement throughout the world that allows refugees to apply. And if they get determined to fit the category of fleeing for political persecution, then they can be resettled in a host country like the United Kingdom, the United States, Ireland. In the U.S., I would point out, is the world's refugee resettlement leader. We've resettled more refugees in this country than any other country in the world. Since the 1980s, we've resettled about 3 million people, which is more than anywhere else. So what we're seeing in recent years is the kind of, from some parts of the United States, the sort of anti-refugee sentiment that we saw certainly in the previous administration, and what we see in certain corners of the U.S. population is unusual historically. Like, we've been a refugee resettlement home for many, many years for people around the world. And so the anti-refugee sentiment is somewhat new. Now, of course, we've had anti-immigrant sentiment in the United States ever since the country was founded. The Chinese Exclusion Act in the 1880s. We have a long history in this country of being anti-immigrant, but being anti-refugee specifically is relatively new in the United States. In the 80s, we were proudly settling people from Afghanistan, Vietnam, and other countries. And so that's somewhat of a new sentiment to my mind.
So how do you make that distinction between refugees and immigrants? If someone was to ask you that question, what is the difference?
Absolutely. Well, I'd say not all refugees see themselves as immigrants. So a lot of refugees will say to you, I'm not an immigrant, and you need to understand that. And what they mean when they say that, and not every refugee says that, but some of them do. And what they mean by that is an immigrant we would think of as somebody who chooses to move, somebody who says, I want to go to this other place and live there because I think it'll be better. I think it'll be whatever. I've got a job there. I might make more money there. Whereas refugees have moved because they were forced to move. And they didn't want to move. Like, if they had the choice, they wouldn't have moved. They would stay in their home. But their home got bombed. Aleppo got destroyed, and they couldn't live there anymore. And which of us wouldn't do whatever we could for our children? I've got a 10-year-old son, and if my town here in the San Francisco Bay Area was being bombed, I wouldn't stay here. I'd do anything I could to save his life and protect him. And I would jump on a boat and go somewhere. And I wouldn't want to do it, but I would be forced to do it. And that's what's particular to the refugee experience, is that they didn't choose to leave. They were forced out. And all things being equal, they wouldn't have left. So it's a very particular type of immigrant.
Right. And I think that's really interesting because a lot of immigrants see themselves in that way. that they're moving because there is no food, there is no job, there is no way to support their families. They have to move. Maybe it's not for, the same reasons as a refugee, for political persecution or whatever, but they're still leaving because they can't stay.
Yeah, that's absolutely right. I mean, the vast majority of people, whether they're refugees or immigrants or whatever, would choose to stay in their home, their home region, if they could. But for whatever reason, that home has become not livable, and with climate change over the next however many years, that's going to produce even more migrations of people who can no longer live in a particular place because maybe the climate has changed. It's become literally too hot to live in that place anymore, or the water has dried up and there's literally no more water in this place. And so people will have to move. And I think we'll see over the coming years, people moving for climate reasons, which will be complicated because as a legal matter, those people wouldn't be considered refugees. If you're leaving because of a climate disaster, that does not fit the legal definition of a refugee. So you can't get refugee status if you're leaving for a climate reason. So that's going to be a thing, right? Do we go back and revisit as a global community the definition of refugee to accommodate people who are fleeing for climate? We probably won't do that. I don't imagine the global community is going to rethink the definition of a refugee to make it broader and more inclusive than it currently is. So what you're going to see is a lot of people moving who won't get that sort of refugee status. The other reason that you can't get refugee is if you're leaving for economic reasons. If you're leaving because your economy is bad, well, that doesn't earn you refugee status either. You have to be fleeing persecution due to one of 5 very narrow and specific reasons having to do with race, religion, nationality, and political opinion. But if you don't fit those categories, you technically can't get refugee status.
That's really interesting. And one of the plays you're working on right now, is it called The Tortilla Curtain? Is that correct?
That's one of my older plays. That's right. I wrote that about 10 years ago. More than that. My goodness, I wrote Tortilla Curtain 12 years ago. It's based on a book by T.C. Boyle of the same name. And that book is about 2 people from Mexico who come to Los Angeles and try to create a life for themselves.
And so that's more of an immigrant. That's someone who migrates here to make a life in the United States.
That's a very good point. Yeah, those folks in the book Tortilla Curtain would not likely get refugee status because they probably couldn't prove that they were persecuted in their home. They're moving for economic reasons, and that wouldn't get you refugee status for that. But I am working on a project now that's about Syrian refugees. I'm co-writing it with an actor and author in London. And so the 2 of us meet about twice a week. We meet on Zoom and we write scenes and revise them. And so we're writing a piece about Syrian refugees going to England.
That's going to be interesting.
Yeah, working with him has been incredible. Gosh, because of the time difference, we do it at 6 a.m. my time, which is early for me. I'm not usually on the computer and working at 6 in the morning. It means getting up at 5 so I can have breakfast and get a cup of coffee and be ready for 6. But that's 2 p.m. London time. So we don't want to move it back too much because then it's too late for him.
Right. Well, there's so many interesting stories about people in all walks of life and how they, just how, you ended up in Ireland because you chose to go study there. But then a lot of the people that you got to know were refugees. And it sounds like that became part of your heart story, because you got to know them on a personal level. And I think a lot of times it's that personal connection. It's not about laws. Yes, it is about laws. But I mean, when people feel empathy and really have a heart to tell a story, it's about that personal connection.
Yeah, I suppose that's right. Those of us in arts and academia probably study and focus on the things we do for very personal reasons. We met somebody, or we have a friend who's this way, or we experienced something ourselves. And I suppose as long as we're talking about refugees, another thing I would say is that there's such a diverse community. Refugees are everybody. They're lawyers, they're teachers, they're doctors, they're politicians, right? Everybody is affected when a war happens in a place and you have to leave. And so they're not, there are all sorts of people that end up becoming refugees is the point I'm making. And it's a pretty diverse group of people.
My final question is that why the arts? How does the arts tell a controversial story and make an impact?
Yeah, well, it's kind of what you said a moment ago about empathy. The arts, if they do anything, they create moments of empathy, especially the performing arts and theater in particular. It's about coming into a theater. You sit there with a bunch of other live bodies in a space, and you watch other live people on a stage tell you a story. And that is just set up to be an empathetic environment. And just in its very structure, theater is set up for telling stories about people who are maybe marginalized or lonely or wounded, hurt in some ways. And, the story then becomes this sort of public thing that people connect with and empathize with. And so that's what the arts are all about, sort of putting a human face on the news stories or the numbers or the things that we see in these cold, hard facts. The arts are all about putting a human face on that and making it a source of empathy, life, love, all those things.
Well, I know I said that was my last question, but it's not, because when I heard you talk, I wanted to know, when you've watched professional theater and the things that have moved you, what theater pieces have been your biggest inspiration?
Well, so many things, I'll just mention two of them quickly. I saw a piece in Scotland about 15 years ago that has really stuck with me. It was by a Polish company called Theatre of the Goat, and the piece was an adaptation of the Chronicles of Gilgamesh. And I'm not kidding you, it was an hour long, and it was all movement, no spoken language, hardly at all. It was all movement and physicality and dance. And there wasn't a dry eye in the house. Like, everybody was weeping. How does dance and movement and music get an audience to cry? Like, that is amazing, right? Like, you can say, a moving story will get people to cry. Of course it will. But how do you get people to cry? Because what you've created is just so incredibly perfect and beautiful that people are like weeping in the audience. I can't tell you how they did it, but I know that as a theater practitioner watching that, I think back to that piece all the time because it was truly the sort of magic of live performance. Right.
And you said, I want to do that.
Well, yeah. I mean, if you can try to capture that in your work, you've captured something pretty important. It's like lightning the bottle. If you can get that into your theater piece, you've got a really special piece. Hamilton does that. That was the other piece I'm going to say. I mean, so many people are influenced by Hamilton because it's such a beautiful and great piece of theater. Yeah, for folks who have not seen that piece, it captures lightning in a bottle. I mean, there's a reason why that's probably the most famous piece of theater in the last however 100 years in this country, because it is really great.
Well, it's been great talking to you, Matthew.
Well, thank you. As I said, I'm honored to be here. Thank you very much.
Yeah, well, it has been inspiring to me to talk to you and know that you have this heart passion and you're making it work. And a lot of times people have a heart passion, but they don't know how to make it work. But you have figured that out. And so good for you.
It takes a long time. If there are any young people listening to this, I would say it can take a long time, and just stick with it. Keep doing it. And the next thing you know, you will be the person who does that thing.
Right. And you've made a living. You've earned awards. You've obviously worked really hard to where you are today. So congratulations.
Thank you. Honored to be here.
All right. Take care. Thank you for joining us for this episode of What's Your Why? Brought to you by Wyoming Humanities with support from Wyoming Community Foundation and generous supporters like you. To learn more, go to thinkwhy.org, subscribe, and never miss a show.